Welcome to our next session of our CNAS annual conference here. Today we're going to be talking about federalism and national security in an era of robust state power, building on a project that we have been conducting this year here at the Center for New American Security. I'm Carrie Cordero. I'm the Robert Gates Senior Fellow here at CNAS, and I'm joined by my two colleagues, Corin Stone and Samantha Vinograd, who I'll share some information about them in a minute. I'm delighted to have both of them with you, and thank you so much for tuning in virtually, and for those of you who are here in person, grateful to have you here. This project, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of why we're talking about state power and state authorities and state involvement in national security issues. This comes from a project that we launched early this year that is focused on an emerging trend of greater state involvement in national security issues. And there's really two different ways that we are thinking about this issue. One has to do with when states at the state level, whether it's governors or state legislatures, are doing things, taking some action that impacts national security in some way. The other side of that issue is when states or at the local level, but primarily states, either governors or through their legislators, are doing something in response to a national security justification. So for example, intelligence community reporting or issues regarding foreign affairs or national security issues that then is causing the state to take a particular action. So in our project, we're looking at both of those types of issues. And we conducted a scenario-based exercise last month with both Corin and Sam were able to join us for. And so in a moment, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that scenario exercise and how it plays out on some of the particular issues that we're seeing in this area of emerging trends of states taking more action and being more players in the national security space. I'm joined, as I mentioned, by Corin Stone, who is a national security leader with more than 20 years of government experience. She has been both a lawyer in government as well as a senior national security executive, holding positions at the Defense Department, at the National Security Agency, and at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where we had the opportunity to work together. Most recently, from 2022 to 24, she was the Principal Deputy General Counsel at the Defense Department. She has also held senior appointments at the National Security Agency and a variety of positions at senior levels at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, both on the policy side and on the legal side, and she also helped stand up that organization when it first was created. I'm also delighted to welcome to CNAS Sam Vinograd, who currently is in the private sector leading Brunswick Group's U.S. geopolitical practice. Sam has served under 3 different bipartisan administrations, as well as in the private sector. She also most recently left government service in her most recent position as Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism, Threat Prevention, and Law Enforcement Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. She also previously, among various roles in government, had served in President Obama's National Security Council as the Director for Iraq, Director for International Economics and Energy, and as a senior advisor to the National Security Advisor. You may also recognize Sam because she is a CBS News contributor and a former colleague of mine on the media side as well. So delighted to welcome 2 former colleagues and current peers who thankfully have really recent government experience as well as decades of experience that they can share with us across different departments. So today we're going to be thinking about these federalism issues from the perspective of folks who have sat in federal government positions. Down the road, as we continue this project, we'll have a future event where we're able to feature also individuals who have been at the state level. But as I mentioned, last month we conducted a scenario-based exercise here at CNAS based on this project. And both Sam and Corin were able to participate in that with a good number of other national security lawyers, constitutional lawyers, national security practitioners, folks who had been in and out of government and had a wide variety of experiences. And what we did is we ran 2 different scenarios that we thought really teased out some of the issues that we're currently seeing in terms of state involvement in national security. The first scenario was focused on National Guard authorities and the tensions that can potentially arise between the federal government, between the presidency and states, particularly in a circumstance where they might disagree about the use of National Guard authorities. Sort of controversy or consideration of National Guard authorities is nothing new. We happened to run the exercise the same week that was the anniversary of the Kent State shootings in 1970. And yet, more recently, when there were questions regarding the use of National Guard authorities after January 6, 2021, old issues also become new issues again. And so we currently are in an environment where there is some question, and some of the events of January 6 brought out some questions about whether or not the legal authorities governing the use of National Guard could use some clarity. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. The second scenario that we ran during the exercise had to do with the potential scenario where a state might limit use or ban use of a particular social media app. And the premise for that was foreign influence, and foreign influence that would potentially impact an election. And so what we tried to do in that scenario was, A, figure out whether or not a state would really have the ability to do that, and 2, one of the issues that we'll talk about here is how is the federal government, and particularly the intelligence community, the national security apparatus, how do they think about foreign influence, and how are they thinking about pushing information out to states that might generate interest at the state level for taking action to, for example, protect their elections. So that is all by way of background to give you a little sense of how we got to the point of exploring this issue, some of the issues that we tried to explore in the tabletop exercise. And so I'm so grateful for Corin and Sam to be here with me today, to be able to give some of your perspective from having participated in this exercise, but also add in your thoughts just based on your decades of government service, working at both on the legal issues and on the policy issues as well. Let me start with you, Corin. You've both served at the Department of Defense, and in our exercise, you were in the National Guard scenario, which, by the way, was set in Texas, pertaining to a protest activity surrounding Middle East exercises, but we worked on that scenario many months and weeks before real-world events sort of caught up to it. Corin, you were on the Defense Department team, logically. What were the types of issues as the scenario played out in terms of thinking about if there would be a potential conflict between a state wanting to use their National Guard authorities and maybe the president was not thinking that that was the right thing to do at that certain time? What was the thinking on the team going through from the Defense Department team perspective?
Thank you, Carrie. It's nice to be here with you. Thank you. So the team initially, of course, started questioning what the Texas governor wanted to do, wanted to understand more fully the intent of the Texas governor and whether the Texas governor wanted the federal government to come in and play a role or wanted it to be a state matter. Also considered whether the president had the authority to federalize the National Guard, should he want to do so, and then what the Defense Department would recommend, what the Secretary of Defense would recommend to the president in terms of whether to federalize. And so when we talked with the Texas team, the Texas governor was clear that she was trying to de-escalate the situation on the border and did not want the federal government to get involved in any way. We did think in talking ourselves and with the DOJ team that we did, and the president did have the authority to federalize the National Guard if he wanted to. And some of the conversation was about whether the president should federalize the National Guard so that it would sort of take it out of the state space and could have a little more control over how the National Guard would be used. If it's in a state status, then the governor fully controls the National Guard and can determine how that guard is used, and they can be used for law enforcement functions. If it's in a federalized status, fully federalized, they're more like active duty military soldiers, cannot be used for law enforcement unless there's a statutory exception like the Insurrection Act. And the president has the ability to fully decide how to use them. So even if they could be used in a law enforcement status, the secretary might recommend to the president that they not be used in that way and that they just be in a supporting role. So we had a lot of conversation about what the right thing was to do there. In this case, because the Texas governor wanted to peacefully de-escalate, we decided that we would send someone from the National Guard Bureau down. So the National Guard Bureau is the entity within DOD proper that kind of oversees all of the National Guard across the country. And that's a federal office. And so we thought putting a federal liaison down with the Texas National Guard would help ensure that we stayed in sync and close communication, and that if things kind of went a different direction, we would have the ability to know quickly and make decisions quickly. So that's kind of the conversation that we had.
So Sam, let me turn to you. You were, if I remember correctly, you were on the White House team for this particular scenario. While this was going on the Defense Department side, how would a White House, or how was a White House in our hypothetical situation thinking through this issue when there would be a potential dispute over how to use the Guard?
Sure, and Carrie, let me just say the scenario was fantastic. I think we covered a lot of bases, and the timing was quite opportune. So from a White House perspective, just having worked on these issues directly, I will tell you that from a general perspective, the relationship between the federal government and state and local authorities is actually viewed as a shining example of ways to cooperate effectively, whether that be on the intelligence gathering or sharing side and on actual operational coordination. So when we talk about the range of law enforcement resources available, state resources are, generally speaking, viewed as a very helpful go-to resource to deal with situations on the ground. From a White House perspective, I think I played the Homeland Security Advisor, so it's always fun playing Dr. Liz Sherwood-Randall. And what we were thinking about was, A, what is the actual situation on the ground? B, how do we anticipate that this could escalate? And C, what other state and local authorities might be available to try to de-escalate the situation? So the Department of Homeland Security has a range of liaison relationships with state and locals. Texas PD, Texas Homeland Security Advisor, and others, but thinking about what relationships to leverage and how, it's interesting to note that the Secretary of Defense did actually authorize the Secretary of Homeland Security under federal authorities to send National Guard members to the border with Texas, and I believe it was 2023 when Title 42 was lifted. So there is a history of using the National Guard in Texas. In this particular scenario, we did decide from a White House perspective, and again, the Homeland Security Advisor is not about politics or press, it's about really the operational response coordination, that it was not appropriate for the White House to weigh in on whether the governor did choose to deploy the Texas National Guard under Title 32 authority.
So Texas is a little bit of a unique situation in comparison to how some of the other states. Corin, just speaking generally about the use of National Guard authorities across the country, not just in Texas, can you give us a little bit more insight, drawing from your experience as Deputy General Counsel at DOD and your government experience? Can you give us a little better sense in terms of how much authority the Secretary of Defense really does have over National Guard, sort of writ large?
Yeah, it's quite a complex structure. So there's 3 different statuses that the National Guard can have. The first is in a state active duty status, where the state governor fully controls the National Guard, and really the Secretary and the President have very little control whatsoever. And that's, to do things like respond to state natural disasters or to smaller events that are really state contained in the state. Then on the other extreme end, there is federalizing the National Guard into what's called a Title 10 status, which is essentially making them like active duty military in the federal military, the federal government. And in that scenario, the Secretary of Defense and the President have full command and control over those troops. And then there's this middle ground called Title 32, which is sort of a hybrid of the first two. So when they're in Title 32 status, the Secretary and the President will give the troops and the governor the mission that they have to perform, and they give them the funding and the training and the equipment. But it is the state governor and the adjutant general, also called the TAG, that actually is in command and helps ensure that the troops are carrying out that mission. And so the cooperation is absolutely critical between the state and the federal government. And one example of this was in 2020 with the COVID vaccine, when they needed the vaccine to be given all across the country, the federal government did. And there weren't enough people necessarily everywhere to do that. As Sam said, it's a great surge capacity for all sorts of things. And so the federal mission was to provide the COVID vaccine to whoever wanted it, but the states really had the con for how to do it. They were the ones implementing that mission, and the governors were in charge of making sure that the National Guard did what they needed to do to be able to get the vaccine to people. So that's a hybrid status, and it's just a good example of the coordination and cooperation that's so critical amongst the federal and state authorities. And I would say that, the control over the National Guard in that situation is quite complex, especially if there is a disagreement.
So, Sam, you mentioned something earlier when you were talking about the role of the Homeland Security Advisor, and you said, the Homeland Security Advisor is focused on the mission. I think what the takeaway is focused on the mission, not a partisan person. So, whether it's Homeland Security Advisor serving in this administration or another, it's really tends to be an individual in the job that is there to perform that particular mission and, protect the security of the country. One of the things that came out of some of the observations that our participants made after the exercise, particularly because this was a scenario that involved federal government and Texas and sort of a heightened, protest activity, so heightened sort of political sensitivities. One of the observations that I remember was made was that so much of the outcome of how this would play out depended on the participation of rational actors. That all the individuals in the positions of authority, whether it was in this case Texas National Guard, the governor's office, the adjutant general, or in the federal government, that it depended on political leaders and national security leaders who are acting in a rational way. What was sort of your thinking in terms of when we think about this particular use of authorities, which is a really critical use of authorities, and there's so many protective and proactive ways that it can be used to help the country. You mentioned COVID, hurricane, there are all sorts of national disasters that National Guard has used. How do you view sort of the role of the players in the process?
Great question. I will actually note that when COVID did break out, and Corin can correct me if I'm wrong, there's actually a court case about whether the Department of Defense could mandate that all National Guard members become vaccinated. I forget which state sued, but ultimately the Supreme Court sided with the federal government, and that blanket vaccination had to go through. So when we think about the National Guard, as a general matter, at the federal level, we viewed calling in the National Guard as somewhat of a last resort. We viewed relying on state and local authorities who frankly know the operating environment better as better first steps and kind of a knee-jerk, let's call in the National Guard, because calling in the military, whether it's a National Guard or the, actual like permanent army or something of that nature, does send a different signal, and there's very different skill sets. So calling in the National Guard to de-escalate a protest or civil unrest on a college campus, I'm unclear whether they actually have the training and skills to perform that task. And they very well might, but I'm just unsure. From a law enforcement perspective, generally, that's a key question, particularly post George Floyd. There was litigation in New York on that front. Post George Floyd, post January 6th, who do you send in for First Amendment protected activity that's escalated into something else? So it does depend on having actors on the ground that understand the different skills and capabilities of the law enforcement resources that they have available. And you could see a scenario where a governor may choose to activate a state National Guard under Title 32 or as state active duty status to send a message and as a deterrent for other behavior that governor views as undesirable. And that does put the White House in an uncomfortable position because the White House may not agree that the National Guard is necessary or best positioned to de-escalate a situation, but may choose not to weigh in because ultimately they may not be successful and will be viewed as meddling in state affairs. So the actors that you have in the room does seriously matter, and there are certainly circumstances in which the National Guard is necessary. January 6th is a prime example, and I will tell you without going into details, post January 6th, when we came into office, we did a significant amount of planning to ensure that there is enhanced communication and an operational plan for short or no notice events that very quickly escalate and require a surge in law enforcement resources in the National Capital Region. We encourage other jurisdictions to do exactly that sort of planning. The trucker convoys, I don't know if anyone remembers those, that was another example of where we had these exact discussions about federal resources, law enforcement resources versus state and locals, and ultimately in the trucker convoy scenario, we deferred largely to the states, which did end up in convoys coming to Maryland and Virginia and kind of circling the Beltway for a while, but the decision was made that that was the most prudent path forward.
You mentioned some of the litigations that have gotten involved, and so we're going to come back, hold that thought, because we're going to come back a little bit to sort of the increased role in litigation in affecting the ability of administrations of both sides of the aisle to be able to implement the policies that they want to implement in the national security and homeland security space. All right, so I want to shift us off from some of the discussion of the National Guard and talk a little bit about the second scenario that we ran at the exercise. So again, this is sort of the flip side where there is a national security justification and then a state takes an action based on that. So we see this in other types of events that play out in the world. Sometimes there are governors currently who are making economic decisions for their state. For example, whether to allow certain foreign investment in a certain industry or physical plant in their state, and they're making decisions based on what they perceive as national security equities or national security concerns about that foreign investment. Another area that we explored in the scenario exercise was when there is information from the intelligence community reporting on potential foreign influence, so foreign adversaries that are using social media to impact something in the United States, particularly elections. And so this has been obviously an issue of 2016, 2020. In 2020, the U.S. government, intelligence community, and DHS took a lot of efforts to be very, very forward-leaning on transparency about foreign intelligence threats to the election in particular. So in other words, foreign adversaries trying to influence the behavior of American citizens and how they then, and then the potential for that to impact the election. We sort of took that real world sequence of events and sort of recent experiences of the United States and pushed it to its max as it would play out at the state level, such that a governor, in this case, in this scenario, it was the governor of California, was on the receiving end of intelligence information from the U.S. intelligence community that there's foreign influence, adversary countries trying to influence the election, and the state having responsibility for administering elections felt like it needed, in the scenario exercise, felt like it needed to do something with that information. And therefore, the scenario that we played out was that the governor issued an executive order to ban access to that particular social media app. Now, that's a pretty dramatic activity, particularly if it's a US-based company, but that's how we played it out. Corin, I want to ask you to put on some of your former hats from serving in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Can you just share with us a little bit about sort of the arc of intelligence transparency and how the intelligence community over time has thought about pushing information out, not just to state and locals, but to the public generally as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has evolved a lot over the last 10 to 20 years. Of course, after 9/11, it started with making sure that we were pushing information to each other in the intelligence community and connecting the dots. And then we saw a lot of different policies come out of the DNI's team that basically talked about writing for release, so writing intelligence products that could balance the protection of sources and methods with getting information where it needed to go, when it needed to go there. And of course, that's always the two sides of the coin that people are always concerned about. There was another policy related to writing tare lines, which essentially is a product that is at a lower level of classification that provides enough detail to act on, but not so much, again, that it would harm sources and methods. And so there's a constant conversation as this is happening in terms of how much information we can put out, how much warning we can give to people with clearances, without clearances, the American public, and what information we can provide without causing damage to our sources and methods. In 2015, the DNI put out the IC Principles of Transparency, again, to push even more forward this idea that we have got to be open as much as we can with the American people about what we're seeing as an intelligence community and the threats that exist, and putting, real good information out there in a world that, now was seeing a lot more misinformation and disinformation, and that was causing grave concern, of course. And then we had the election scenario in 2016, and that just continued to reinforce this need to be more forward-leaning. That said, it's still the intelligence community. There's still a lot of concern about, of course, for good reason, protecting sources and methods. And so it's an art. It's not a science. And each time you put something together, you have to do that balance and make sure you're thinking about the public interest and the need of the public to have information and sort of how far you have to go in releasing information and what you need to protect. And so I would guess, I haven't been there in a couple of years, but I would venture to guess that in this election cycle, they're constantly thinking about that again and trying to be as forward-leaning as possible and as transparent as possible while, of course, protecting sources and methods.
Sam, how do you think about the intelligence transparency piece, particularly as it relates to foreign influence in elections?
I think we've made a lot of headway. I think that there is now, as Director Haynes briefed in front of Congress, there is now a notification framework process for alerting the right folks within the federal government, potentially others, about a foreign malign influence campaign. The Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, under former Director Chris Krebs, really doubled down on something known as rumor control, which would, after a very rigorous process, put out factual information about false narratives that are percolating related to elections. It's not every disinformation or foreign malign influence narrative. Again, rigorous process to choose what to really issue factual information about, but I think that's been effective. I think where it gets very dicey is the fact that our adversaries are not static. Our adversaries are consistently innovating. And when we talk about foreign malign influence versus quote unquote domestic disinformation, we know that our adversaries try to launder disinformation narratives through Americans. And they've been quite successful in doing so. So if you try to separate out what's foreign misdis or malinformation and what's domestic disinformation, it's really just an amalgam of a lot of the same actors laundering content. And so while I think that identifying and in certain instances responding with factual information to counter foreign malign influence is important, I also think we have to look at the demand side for that information, and that's where we get into how do we build up resiliency within our communities to both identify it. Social media companies, I do think, could do more on that front, but also just as consumers of information, whether it's us, elderly people are very prone to foreign malign influence attacks, young people, how do we build up the kind of resiliency to try to guard against that information? I oftentimes use a metaphor that in every other part of our lives, we take security precautions, right? We lock our doors, we put on our seatbelts, we look to cross both sides of the street. There is not a culture in this country of taking security precautions when it comes to the information we're digesting, and that's where I think we need to focus going forward.
So in our exercise, we asked you to sort of look through things through the looking glass, and we put you on this. You were on the state team thinking about things from a Homeland Security advisor perspective for our fictional state of California at the time. It would be a pretty dramatic action for a state government, for a governor, to limit access to a social media platform. But from the governor's perspective, if they're thinking about it, they're getting this scary information from the intelligence community. They're thinking about their responsibilities at the state level to conduct a free and fair election. So put us a little bit in the room of your team that was the state of California. Like, how were they thinking through either the First Amendment issues or just the nature of taking such a dramatic action?
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding generally in this country about what social media platforms are. I mean, they are private companies at the end of the day. So I would expect if this move actually happened, there would be significant litigation.
Right.
But
that is where our scenario went. Very quickly tied up in litigation.
Yeah, you all are the lawyers. I'm not. But the First Amendment issues, sure. But by the same token, the fact that these are private companies, right, I believe, does make a difference. Now, I think from a Homeland Security Advisor perspective, I would assume at the state level that this was unlikely to have a massive impact on the ground insofar as, banning a social media app in my state just meant that it could probably go somewhere else. And I would understand that kind of level of deplatforming was unlikely to have a significant impact within the state, but I would hope that it would send a message and that any economic impact that the company would incur as a result of this act would lead them to change their behavior in some way. And for example, and the government can't force social media companies to do this, but they can encourage them to revisit their codes of conduct and see if they need to be updated or evolved, or if they're interpreting them in a way that's consistent with the threat environment. Would hope that social media company would think through steps that it could take to ameliorate any issues on their platform. And
that type of interaction itself is the subject of ongoing litigation right now as well. Corin, I want to ask you just one sort of last question on this transparency piece. Is there something special about elections, that elections in particular, that you think lends itself, thinking back on your roles in terms of developing policies for the intelligence community on transparency and information sharing? Are elections sort of a special category, or should we be thinking about it in a more general way, and there are just particular issues that the community needs to be more public about, the intelligence community needs to be more public about, or be more forward-leaning on declassification?
I think it's a little bit of both. So in one sense, you're not going to see elections necessarily called out in these policies, but I think everybody recognizes that the public interest in fair and open and free elections is core to our democracy. And so, people are very, very concerned and focused about making sure that we do everything we can to support free and open and fair elections and ensure that the American people have the information they need when it comes to elections. So I think there are certainly those conversations when it comes to what the public interest is, and in the case of elections, it's certainly very clear and much, much stronger than some other cases.
You both have mentioned litigation, so throughout this conversation, and of course some of the drivers when we talk and think about state action or states getting involved in national security, the way that has played out in practice as a practical matter has often been through litigation and through states' attorneys general litigating against particular issues. Probably the most prominent example that everybody is familiar with, and so we did not actually run it as an exercise because we think there is sort of allowed in the public to deal with it, is the issue of immigration and border security and how states have litigated in that area on a bipartisan basis. I mean, there was a lot of attention drawn to litigation against Trump administration and border security immigration policies, but just today I read that I believe the ACLU is going to litigate against just a new order that President Biden issued on asylum. So it's really the specter of litigation, whether it's state generated or by outside organizations, really does affect administrations on a bipartisan base from trying to implement certain types of policies. I mentioned border and immigration security because that's sort of the issue that is in the public domain quite a bit and is reported on quite a bit. But just zooming out a little bit more generally, Corin, I'll start with you. Zooming out a little bit more generally, because you've served as both lawyer to cabinet heads, agency heads, senior executives in government, and you have been a policy leader yourself in different roles. Can you talk a little bit, maybe sort of if you look at like the last 10 years or so of your experience in government, how has the impact of litigation on national security and homeland, national security related issues affected the policymaking process?
There's definitely been an impact in that, you see policymakers much more often asking for detailed litigation risk assessments from the lawyers, and they want to fully understand, whether and what that litigation might look like, the impact of that litigation, not just in potentially undoing or pausing a policy goal, but also all the things that support that policy. There could be personnel moves and office changes and technology and all sorts of things that underlie a particular policy that's going to be put in place. And if all that can be upended or there's an injunction that stops it in its tracks, that's a pretty important piece of information for a policymaker to consider. I mean, I struggled as a lawyer to try to take the litigation out of the conversation as much as possible, although wanting to make sure that it was informing decision makers. Certainly they should go in eyes wide open and understand the different various issues that could arise from litigation. But on the other hand, I felt as a lawyer it was my job to say, you need to make the decision that you think is right from a policy perspective, and it's our job, along with DOJ, to try to defend that decision, and we'll do our very best to defend it. But there are practical implications. Even if we win after, at the end of the day, after much litigation, there could be an injunction, it could be paused, it could be delayed, there could be all sorts of other things that happen. That have a real impact on the department, on the federal government, on the people, and so it's quite important to understand that, but I didn't want litigation to drive policy.
Sam, from your perspective on the policy side of things, did you sort of from serving earlier in government and then coming back in government, did you have any observations from a policymaker perspective in terms of how litigation was potentially affecting things that you and your colleagues were trying to do in the national security or homeland security
I'll
space?
say it does have an operational impact. So when you're thinking about something like the executive order that just came out on banning certain asylum processing between ports of entry at the border, if you are expecting litigation, if you're expecting an injunction, your operational components, in this case Customs and Border Protection and potentially Immigration and Customs Enforcement, need to understand that there might be a halt in operations and build an operational plan that can be flexible in that regard. So I have never been in an instance where a policy that could make a significant difference for national security was put on hold because litigation was expected. But it is factored into the discussion, and it should be, to do operational planning and just to understand what kind of strategy needs to be in place.
Great. Great. Well, I want to thank Sam Vinograd and Corin Stone. Please join me in thanking them for joining us here today. Really thoughtful conversation. Appreciate both of you lending your vast experience and expertise with us. And if you are watching virtually, please stay with us. Next up, we've got the CNAS Technology and National Security Program that's going to ask and answer some of your most important questions on issues of technology policy, talk about some of their new research. So please join us. That session will begin at 2:50. Thanks.